at Home Shakespeare.
Hello everyone, I'm Emma Whipday. Welcome to week 4 of Stay at Home Shakespeare with A Bit Lit. As those of you who've been watching the series may know, Stay at Home Shakespeare is both discussions about Shakespeare from my home potentially to you and yours as I'm here in lockdown, and also an exploration of what the home means in Shakespeare and how Shakespeare represented spaces of the home on stage. Today, we're going to be looking at Othello, and I've been particularly excited about talking about this play because it's a play that's often discussed as Shakespeare's only domestic tragedy. Domestic tragedies are tragedies that are about the home, that are tragedies of the home, and many of them from this period are written by anonymous writers and based on recent true crimes. I actually happen to think that just about all the plays I'm discussing in this series are domestic tragedies, because they're all plays with tragedy in the home at their centre, and they all explore ideas of what a home is. But Othello has been an obvious choice for the genre of domestic tragedy for centuries, because it is a play that's really concerned with the stuff of the home, the material of the home, and the idea of the home. And I'm going to say a bit more about that in a moment. It is also, of course, a play about the insidious and pernicious effects of racism on Othello himself. He's poisoned by the misogynistic and racist words of Iago, and this poison eventually leads him to murder his wife. It's also, you could say, a racist play because of the way that it plays on these ideas of race in staging Othello's eventual willingness to murder. But I'm not going to be exploring those aspects today because I want to particularly focus on the misogyny that Othello is being sort of gradually drip-fed by Iago. I feel that the play is saturated with this misogynistic discourse, and the play really interrogates how the ideas that Othello has about women, and some of the ideas about women in early modern culture in general, are part of what lead to the tragedy. However, having set all of this, I'm going to start in a slightly unexpected place because I want to start with a comic song. It's a song from 1807 and it's sung by Mr. Bannister, and it's an early Victorian comedy version of Othello. And I have to thank here my husband, Oskar Cox Jensen, who works on popular song in the 18th and 19th centuries and who suggested this song to me. I can't quite believe that I'm about to sing a song on the internet. Please excuse me, I'm not a singer, but I think you'll get a sense of it best if I do sing it rather than just reading it. So here's how it goes. And this is a little way through the song when we get to near the climax of the song, which is basically following the plot of Othello, but in a comic fashion. So when he comes straight home he goes to Mrs. Othello in bed, and says, "Here, dear, I must blow my nose, for I've got a sad cold in my head. A handkerchief, wife, I expect one." So out from the pillow she tossed it. "Not this," he exclaimed, "but the checked one." "Oh, curse it," cries Desdie, "I've lost it." Later in the song, after the tragedy has unfolded, the singer sings, "All this comes from a cold in the head, so blind fortune in this matter shows her eye. Not one of these folks would be dead if they had but worn fine fleecy hosiery." Now this is of course a terrible rhyme to end on, rhyming hosiery with shows her eye, but the moral here seems to be an interesting one. The moral that the singer is drawing is essentially that everyone has died because they all had bad colds and so needed the handkerchief. Now the colds are an invention, the colds don't exist in the play, but the need for the handkerchief and the fact that the handkerchief is such a small, insignificant, domestic, feminine, trivial thing to be at the centre of the tragedy, almost a comic thing to be at the centre of the tragedy, has troubled critics for centuries after Othello's reception. And what I'm going to try and suggest today is that all these early critics were wrong, because the handkerchief is actually what makes the play tragic, and it's also what makes the play a domestic tragedy. But to explain how and why, I need to go back to a quotation I introduced you to in video number 2 about Romeo and Juliet, And this is a quotation from the conduct book A Preparative to Marriage by Henry Smith. Smith writes, "We call the wife housewife, that is, house, wife, to show that a good wife keeps her house, as though home were chastity's keeper. So a wife should teach her feet, go not beyond the door." And as I mentioned before, this is an over-the-top prescription. In fact, women in this period did go outside, but it suggests a real anxiety about the boundaries and thresholds of the home and their relationship with female chastity. A chaste woman in this period was either a virgin who was unmarried or a married woman who was faithful to her husband. And there was a huge anxiety about going beyond the home and becoming an adulteress, and a real association between the body of a woman and the body of her home. We can see this also in an emblem from the period, a moral emblem, which is a picture that had a moral message. This is from Guillaume de la Perriere's The Theatre of Fine Devices, which was published in England in 1614, just over a decade after Othello's first performance, but had been circulating in French sometime before that. This emblem has the title, "Within this picture are displayed the beauties of a woman stayed." And in the picture, you can see a scantily clad woman with her foot on a tortoise, holding a massive key, sitting on a bed. And the verse that accompanies the picture says, "This picture here doth lively represent the beauties that may best make women proud. First, by the tortoise at her feet is meant, she must not gad, but learn at home to shroud." So here the ideal woman, and particularly the ideal wife, is being associated with her home. And I love this image of the tortoise, because essentially a tortoise is like the ideal woman, because he quite literally carries his home on his back in the form of a shell, and can disappear into it at any time. I think that's wonderful. It continues, "Her finger to her lip is upward bent, to signify she should not be too loud." So the ideal woman not only stays at home in this period, but is also a quiet one. And of course, again, this is not a prescription that women actually tended to live by, which we know from church court periods in the period, which have some very vocal women discussing the faults of other men and women, and which also suggest that some women were complained of by their husbands for being too vocal. Then the verse continues, "The key doth note she must have care to guide, the goods her husband doth with pain provide." So again, this association between the home and the female body, and also between the items within the home, the husband's possessions. She's supposed to guard all three. So this massive, quite phallic key suggests that she keeps the home and the possessions within it locked up. And as a number of critics have noticed, the fact that she's holding this key while scantily clad suggests that she and her sexuality are part of the goods that are locked up in the home, and that she has the responsibility for keeping locked up. And we can see this in the beginning of Othello, which again I briefly discussed in video number 2, when in the upper stage, which becomes the window, Iago calls up, "Awake, what ho, Brabantio, thieves, 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 look to your house, your daughter and your bags, thieves, thieves, thieves." And this is how Iago gives Brabantio the news of his daughter's elopement, in discussing her not in terms of her love and the fact that she's run away with Othello, but in terms of theft. He says, "Look to your house, your daughter and your bags," suggesting that with the elopement of his daughter, his home and his possessions are also vulnerable. A couple of lines later, he says, "Are your doors locked?" So again, that association between lock and key, and between a woman being locked up in the home, possessions being locked up in the home, and a woman's sexuality and body, here because Desdemona has run away with the man she loves to marry him and consummate the marriage. However, having set up this idea of the home and the relationship between the home and the female body, I want to complicate it a little bit, because by the end of the play, this is looking slightly less straightforward. And to help us understand this, I'm going to look at another example of conduct literature. So the line later in the play I want to think about is when Othello himself refers to locks and keys when talking to Desdemona. He talks about her as a closet, lock and key of villainous secrets. So here he's using the language associated with female virtue, the language of locking up a woman, closet, lock and key. And I should add that a closet was a room in this period that you could be private in and that had a key. But he's saying that Desdemona is a closet, lock and key of villainous secrets. So she's not locking herself up to be virtuous. In this metaphor, she's locking up her bad behaviour. And we can understand this by looking at a conduct book called The English Gentlewoman by someone called Richard Brathwaite, which was published in 1631. But the ideas in it were clearly circulating a lot earlier because they're so evident in Othello. Brathwaite writes, "To women, be you in your chambers or private closets." So again, this idea of a locked up, private, virtuous closet. "Be you retired from the eyes of men. Think how the eyes of God are on you. Do not say, the walls encompass me, darkness overshadows me, the curtain of night secures me. These be the words of an adulteress. Therefore do nothing privately, which you would not do publicly." So this is a complication of the idea that a virtuous woman in this period is locked up in her home, because Brathwaite seems to be suggesting that while women should be in their chambers, their bedchambers or their private closets, and they should be away from the male gaze, from the kind of balconies that characters like Juliet find themselves on, and they should be thinking about God, they should also be careful not to think that because they're inside, hidden by the walls, hidden by the darkness at night, that they can commit evil things within that space, that they can be an adulteress in that space. And there seems to be a further anxiety here about women's thoughts. The suggestion seems to be that if a woman really thinks about the fact that she's private and secret and hidden and alone, the first thing she'll think about is some sort of adulterous sex. And you can see the idea about women in this period, this kind of misogyny and obsession with female sexuality that saturates so many of the texts in this period. The idea that a woman wouldn't be alone to pray or to think or to talk to a friend, but that privacy must relate to transgression, that privacy must threaten this woman's husband. And we see this in Othello, when Desdemona is on her own with her waiting gentlewoman, Emilia, and this is shortly before Desdemona is murdered. She says to Emilia, "Dost thou in conscience think, tell me, Emilia, that there be women do abuse their husbands in such gross kind?" And this is because she's been accused of adultery implicitly by Othello, and so she's thinking, are there actually women who cheat on their husbands? And Emilia says, "There be some such, no question." Desdemona says, "Wouldst thou do such a deed for all the world?" So would you commit adultery if you could have the whole world as your reward? And Emilia says, "Why, would not you?" Desdemona answers, "No, by this heavenly light." And Emilia replies, "Nor I neither, by this heavenly light. I might do it as well in the dark." So here you can see exactly the thing that Brathwaite is worried about. Emilia is using her privacy to think about adultery, and what's more, she's associating thinking about adultery with darkness, with night, the idea that she's hidden and secret at night, and therefore can do what she wants. But Desdemona, we see, would not commit adultery. We're told in very clear terms that her husband's suspicions of her are false. So how does Othello come to suspect her? Well, I've made it clear that it's the influence of Iago that affects him, but Iago influences him in a very subtle and clever way by convincing Othello to associate Desdemona's chastity with a handkerchief he's given her. So now we come back to the handkerchief I discussed at the beginning of the video. In the comic song, it's referred to as a checked handkerchief, but it is in fact a handkerchief embroidered with strawberries. And Othello believes that Desdemona has given this handkerchief to Cassio, who's a very handsome young man. But in fact, Desdemona has lost it. It's been picked up by Emilia, her waiting gentlewoman, given by Emilia to her husband Iago, who's then ensured that Cassio has it. So Iago has planted the handkerchief to incriminate Desdemona. But he makes Othello associate the handkerchief with Desdemona through setting up the impossibility of knowing whether Desdemona is truly innocent. Iago says to Othello, "But if I give my wife a handkerchief?" And Othello says, "What then?" And Iago responds, "Why then, 'tis hers, my lord, and being hers, she may, I think, bestow it on any man. So if it's her possession, she can give it to anyone." Othello says, "She is protectress of her honour too. May she give that?" And Iago answers, "Her honour is an essence that's not seen. They have it very oft that have it not." Essentially, chastity is invisible. Honesty is invisible. They have it very oft that have it not suggests that people can seem to have it, but not in fact have it. But he continues, "But for the handkerchief," which is of course a visible material object. So he's linking Desdemona's ownership with of that object with her chastity to incriminate her. And when he says that the handkerchief is hers and being hers, she may, I think, bestow it on any man, he's not just suggesting that Desdemona has similarly bestowed her body on any man and linking a domestic possession with the female body. He's also suggesting an anxiety about female possessions, because in this period women couldn't own property. Technically, just about everything they owned belonged to their husband legally. They didn't have legal powers. There might have been some exceptions, things they'd been given in a dowry that they had written into marriage contracts to ensure they'd hold them if their husband then died. But the majority of things they owned were no longer theirs on marriage. And so there's an anxiety by Iago here that maybe women still hold on to objects that should belong to their husbands, that they have agency and power over them themselves. And this comes back to something else I discussed in video 2, about how young women who eloped from their father's homes, as Juliet does, were simultaneously the possession that should be locked up, but also an agent, a person who can unlock themselves and free themselves. And here Iago is hinting at something similar, that the handkerchief is a possession that Desdemona can give away, and therefore she can also have sexual agency. So I hope I've suggested here why it is that the handkerchief is actually a very significant tragic object. Thomas Rhymer, a 17th century critic writing in A Short View of Tragedy, would have agreed with the opening song about the comic potential of the handkerchief as an object. He called Othello a warning to all good wives that they look well to their linen. So essentially, it's a play about housekeeping, it's a play about women hanging on to their linen, to their handkerchiefs. And he continues, "So much ado, so much stress, so much passion and repetition about a handkerchief. Why was not this called the Tragedy of the Handkerchief?" So as you can tell, he didn't like this play very much. But actually, without knowing it, Rhymer's being quite an acute critic here, because in a period where women's bodies and domestic objects and the home and chastity are all so closely associated, for a woman to lose a handkerchief, to lose her linen, to not be in control of her home's objects and her home's borders, opens her up to danger and makes her vulnerable. And of course, that's exactly what happens to Desdemona. The tragic irony of Othello, though, is that all this imagery of female sexuality being dangerous, of locks and keys, of the fact that women should keep all these things locked up, but even if they lock everything up, they could still be locking up dangerous secrets, like Emilia suggests. All of that is contradicted by the eventual outcome of the play, which suggests, in the end, that men are far more dangerous with locks and keys than women are. Shortly before the murder scene, Othello says to Emilia, "You, mistress, that have the office opposite to St. Peter, and keep the gate of hell." So St. Peter was believed to keep the gate of heaven, so he's suggesting that Emilia, in guarding the door to Desdemona's bedchamber, is guarding the gate of hell. He continues, you, I, you. We have done our course, so we have finished. There's money for your pains. I pray you, turn the key, and keep our counsel." And this is the point at which Othello is getting ready to lock himself in with Desdemona. But the thing that's locked into their bedchamber isn't Desdemona's dangerous secrets. She doesn't have any. It isn't sex. It's murder. It's domestic violence. And that's shown to be the true danger in Othello. That's all for today. Next week, I'm going to be talking about Shakespeare's King Lear, and I'm going to be taking a slightly different approach to the home by thinking about the extent to which Lear is outside the home, and homelessness is the true threat in the play. Thank you very much for listening. You may have noticed that in previous videos I've ended with a quick shout out to a theatre in case you enjoyed this video and would like to donate a couple of pounds. However, today, given the subject matter, I'm going to instead suggest donating to a domestic violence charity. There are many of wonderful ones, but I'm going to be giving a couple of pounds to Refuge. So if you enjoyed this video and you have a couple of pounds to spare, you might like to do the same. Another option would be to donate to an anti-racism charity because of the way this play exposes the pernicious influence of racism. Thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you next week.